Hi, I'm Nicole Tate. Thank you so much for joining Politics for Parents today. I'm really excited about today's discussion for so many reasons, because I think one of the problems we're seeing with our society, especially in recent incidents of violence, is a level of isolation and disconnectedness that is creating this really polarized environment and kind of stoking the flames of animosity in so many camps. So today we're talking with David J., who is releasing a new book called Relationality, where he really dives into how to intentionally pursue relationships and create community. And I think you'll find that this matters to parents in so many ways. Primarily, I wanted to pursue this discussion for this podcast because I think a lot about the idea of the village. So many parents today, especially working moms, I see them saying, "Where is my village?" I know in my community with some of my mom friends, we have built a village and it takes work and intention. And I think, the art and the science of creating meaningful relationships in a lot of ways has become overlooked. And, we do, I think, as a society, require some investment in these spaces. So this discussion is going to dive into all of that. David's book is incredibly thoughtful when it comes to this topic, and I highly recommend it. So I hope you enjoy today's discussion, and I really hope that you will find some ways to take these thoughts and ideas and apply them to your own life to find your village and build it what you need to help your family. Thank you. Nicole Tate, thank you so much for joining Politics for Parents today. And I'm really excited about this conversation with David J., author of the forthcoming book, Relationality. And while the book is not purely focused on familial relationships and caregivers, within the context that we talk about these things on the podcast, I think his book offers a really helpful framework for us all to think about relationships, especially as we, have all been talking about this loneliness epidemic with parents trying to figure out, how to make things work in their household, how to care for their children. I've mentioned before on this podcast, the village it takes to raise a child, and a lot of people wondering, well, where is the village? It's deserted me. So I think this is a really great topic to talk about, how we can form, I think, constructive and meaningful relationships, and how those relationships can help us create really strong foundations for families. And David, in our discussions already, I know you've artfully done this. So I think you have such a great perspective to offer our audience. Before we get into it, I'm just going to, give everyone a little bit on your bio, because I think it's really great to know the work you've done and the expertise you kind of bring to this topic. David J. is the author of the upcoming book, Relationality, a framework for shaping our world through connection, from North Atlantic Books. David believes that humanity needs thriving social movements to address our more pressing challenges as he works to understand and dismantle barriers to those movements receiving funding. As an experienced organizer, David knows that relationships are at the heart of how movements build power. Those relationships are powerful because they evolve in unpredictable ways, and that unpredictability often makes them difficult to fund. To overcome this challenge, David specializes in relational measurement and learning practices that can support funders and community organizers in building trust without requiring communities and movements to behave predictably. So I think that sets a nice little backdrop for who you are and what we're going to talk about today. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. Your book is really thought-provoking and tackles so many societal dynamics that I've thought about for years, just in my own interest in politics, civic discourse, but also as a parent. This is a podcast for parents. You're a parent yourself. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the book and what you're trying to achieve, but then kind of connect it back to your life and your family structure and the way you've been able to achieve really meaningful relationships in your own family.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me on. And I think I might answer those, but in the reverse order. I think I want to start by talking about my experience around forming a family.
Perfect.
And so I can't remember if you mentioned this in my bio, I identify as asexual. Back when I was 18, my introduction to movement work in many ways was starting this website for people like me. I was this like kid. I felt like I was afraid I was the only asexual person in the world. And I just wanted to talk to someone else like me, someone who shared my experience. And that led to me creating this website that became one of the central gathering points for ace people like me in the world. That turned me into movement work, organizing work. That's one of the themes that I want to talk about today. But it also put me on this journey towards having a family. I'm the oldest sibling. I'm one of the oldest cousins in my extended family, and I knew I wanted kids, but I also wasn't going to form traditional romantic or sexual relationships to have those kids in. And so the path to having kids was really mysterious to me. And what I got really good at was sort of forming intentional relationships with my friends, taking what would normally be a friendship and sitting down and saying, hey, this relationship has really come to play an important role in both of our lives. And let's take the time to acknowledge that role a little bit more than friends normally do, to get just a little bit more grateful, a little bit more intentional about how we spend time together. And I found that when I did that with these people, what I would call my aromantic relationships, what I think many people would call their best friends, the relationships sort of became able to be committed in a way that they otherwise couldn't be. And so when I thought about having kids, I started thinking about how do I build really deep, committed relationships with my friends so that when they have kids, I can be playing a deep and committed role in their kids' lives. And that happened most powerfully with uh, my current co-parents, this couple named Avery and Zeke. They're married. I would say I'm in a committed aromantic partnership with both of them. And I spent a while just talking to them, talking to a lot of people in my life about how I knew I wanted kids. I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I thought it was going to happen through some of these committed conversations with friends. And they, 2 years before they were planning to get pregnant, sat me down and said, look, we want to have kids. We want you to be involved. We don't know what that's going to look like, but we want your help figuring that out. And so 2 years later, we had decided, we'd sort of come to an agreement that I was going to be as close to an equal co-parent as we could manage. I moved in with them. I attended birthing classes. When the baby was born, we sort of divided up as best we could, given that Avery was breastfeeding, like the work of caring for a newborn. In California, I was able to legally adopt as a third parent. Now the three of us own our house together. We, as close to as we can, equally share the work of raising kids, raising our two children. We have a 6-year-old and a 7-month-old, and um, and that has been really spacious and really phenomenal. And then the thing that it's turned me on to, that I think is part of what I'm so excited to speak about in this podcast today, is that because that 3-parent model has been so fantastic and spacious for us, a bunch of other people have started coming to us. A bunch of other people have started coming to us and saying, look, we are isolated as parents. We're having our first kid. We're afraid we're going to be isolated as parents. I think we have a very deeply ahistorical culture of parental isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And that work of how do you have an intentional conversation with your friend to be part of a community of care. Maybe they're being a full co-parent. Maybe they're showing up once a week. Maybe they're showing up once a month. But how do you build that network of intention? That's a thing that I think we are unsupported in doing in the
Right.
world today in a way that many other communities around the world, many other communities sort of in this country who don't have the sort of particular race and class backgrounds that I have, and many other communities throughout history have had a lot more support for people who are doing that kind of community of care work around kids and around families. And so something I'm really interested in that I think we haven't gotten too much to my book, but that relates to this question of how do we create the conditions for relationship in the world? How do we
Yep.
support people who are creating conditions for relationship in the world? Is how do we create the conditions to invite parents out of a place of isolation by helping them build intentional communities of care?
Yeah, I mean, so much of what you said is just sounds absolutely wonderful. First of all, having a third parent. I think any mom in America could say, yes, if I could have 10 extra people helping me out, that would be amazing. So from a practical standpoint, it sounds great, but also um, on an emotional level, I think, it is just profound to think about relationships in this way. I mean, I can only imagine what it must have felt like for you when, your co-parent sat you down and broached the subject. That must have been the best day of your life.
It was, I mean, up there with the actual, like, the birth of my kids.
Yeah.
Um, but it was just such a intense moment of relief, having held this uncertainty for my whole, like, knowing I wanted this thing, knowing I wanted this depth of commitment and this opportunity to be a parent, right? Like, I think one thing that I believe, and that I touch on a little in my book, is that I believe that a relationship exists where we change one another.
Yes.
That, like, the to be in relationship is to both change and be changed,
Mhm.
and that's very inspired for me by Octavia Butler. And there's something about the way that being a parent would change me that I knew I wanted, right?
Yeah.
Whenever I was around kids, I was like, oh, I feel myself pulled down to their level, pulled down to their, like, curiosity, their exploration of the world, right? And I want to have that be this part of my life
Yeah.
that I can come back to. And I know plenty of people who, like, know they don't want to be parents. I respect, like, everyone getting to decide
Yeah,
what kind of
absolutely.
role they want to have for kids in their life. I'm someone who knew I really, really wanted kids. So being able to being invited in that way after being afraid for so long that I wouldn't be, and then, like, being a parent has been great. It's been like everything I hoped it would be and more.
Yeah. I can agree. I actually was one of those people who didn't think I wanted kids, and then one day something clicked, and I realized I did. And that's one of the most poignant things I took away from your book is
Mm.
going back to that definition of a relationship, because you do highlight the problematic way the Oxford Dictionary defines relationship, and you offer some different ways to look at it. And for me, the most eye-opening takeaway is that view of a relationship as something, a beneficial and a productive relationship is one where both parties are willing to be changed by it. And unconsciously, I think that's kind of how I've pursued relationships in my life. My husband
Mm.
is not like me. He's very different from me in many ways. We're similar in some ways, and we're complete opposites in others. And some people wonder, well, how does that work? But it is, I think, really fruitful when you come together with people that can teach you things and you can learn from. And I think the way you define that is really valuable. So, could you talk a little bit more about kind of what you think is problematic with our, typical definition of relationship and the, the alternative frameworks and definitions that you propose in the book?
Definitely, and I can give an example of where I've really seen these ineffective definitions of relationship
Mhm.
play out.
Yeah.
Um, and just to make a little bit of bridge to what we were talking about, I talked about this experience of forming deep relations with my friends and learning to be intentional with my friends. Um, and I was really fortunate in that I was in queer community. The asexual community had been supported. I had elders, I had trans elders who'd built these beautiful queer families. Like, I had people teaching me how to do that and supporting me in doing that. And I think that uh, in order to build relationships, we kind of need that sort of support. We need places to build relationship in. We need elders who help us build them, and so that infrastructure, those containers, are really, really important. And when we talk about the part of, to me, what's tragic about not having a good definition of relationship is that the resources that we the resources that we invest in building relationship don't go to those elders. They don't go to those containers, to those really rich lineages that have been building relationship for a long time. They go to things that don't work. And one example of that that I've been really close to um, is something like Facebook, right, or Meta. This is an institution, multi-billion-dollar institution with the mission to build relationship in the world. And part of my life is kind of in the tech reform space. So I do kind of like worker organizing of Meta employees, not around unionization, but around other forms of internal advocacy um, and uh, and the when I looked inside of Meta, their mission was about building relationships, and they had all of these metrics that internal employees were tracking. Like they had one of the most sophisticated data operations in the world,
Mhm.
and they didn't really have an internal sense of what a relationship was. They were like, a relationship exists when two people say that they're friends. It's kind of a line that connects two people, but it either exists or it doesn't exist. A relationship exists when people engage with one another's stuff. So like if you like something or reply to something, then maybe you're in a relationship. But they didn't really have a sense of what it meant. Their mission was to connect people, but what they were doing functionally was like getting people to move down a conversion funnel to engage in the actions they want them to engage
Right.
in. And then they called the actions that they wanted people to engage in, scrolling, clicking, liking, commenting, they called that relationship because it conveniently also drove their business model.
Right.
And I say that as an example because I see that happening a lot where people who value relationship wind up building this system, and then they reward people kind of engaging in whatever predictable behavior they want them to engage. They um
It almost seems like they've
so,
made it
yeah,
more commonplace for relationships to be transactional and for that to be
yeah, exactly.
acceptable.
And
And
there's
personally, like I find that really heartbreaking when I'm in a relationship that I think is actually authentic and it turns out that it's actually just transactional. That's so disappointing, but it seems that way. And I love that Facebook is your example because I feel like that's contributed to a lot of our issues with lack of community and connectedness.
Yeah, I think so. There's this confusion between the relational and transactional
Mm,
that that to me is deeply tragic and is one of the reasons why I think there's a deep underinvestment in the kind of community that we need.
right. Um, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about communities of care, and
Mm,
how your framework and how your book kind of talks about how we can go about forming communities of care. So first of all, what are they? Where do we see them? I know you give some examples of where we see them now. Growing up, I didn't have a very large family, and
mm,
I've always loved the phrase, family are, friends are the, something about friends are the family that you choose.
mm.
And, you give some really great examples of that. So I think it'd be great to talk a little bit about, what can we look to now where there are these communities of care so that we can perhaps try to think about how we can kind of emulate them in our own lives.
I I personally draw from kind of a lineage of queer family.
Mm,
I was around all of these folks who had sort of built chosen families because that was their only option. But because of that, they'd learned how to have these conversations, learned how to be intentional, learn how to engage and care for one another um, uh, in ways that were really beautiful, and I think had a lot more possibility than some of the more like um, I'm sorry, um, but than some of the more like monogamous models around me. But I think
mm,
that the piece of that I that's felt really powerful to me is thinking about lineage. So often our grandparents, the other people who sort of came before us and shaped us, knew a lot about how to build community that the world around us has been slowly forgetting.
mhm.
And so, to me, one of the most powerful ways to think about how we build communities of care is to look at the lineages of communities of care that we come from and see where have those lineages been disrupted? What can we learn from them?
Mm.
I think about my grandmother, who was this really powerful activist in the Jewish community in central Italy. My grandparents were, my grandfather was a physics professor, so this was sort of around a physics department. And all of the incredible work that she did to build relationships in this really innovative, dynamic place.
Mm.
And I think about what are the things that she was doing that I can learn from, um, and take into my own life.
Yeah, and I'd love for you actually to talk about that a little bit more because I loved reading about that in your book. It was really remarkable to, I think, I guess, take in your appreciation for her emotional intelligence is kind of how I was seeing it. She was really um, skilled in a way in building relationships and building community and in a sense building power in a way that was innate to her, but also she seemed to really listen to people around her and kind of was the model of relationship being changed, both parties being changed. So could you talk a little bit more about your grandmother and what you learned from her and some of the examples in the book, because I just think they're wonderful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so Betty Lazarus was incredible. um, and she's living in this world in the University of Illinois physics department in the 50s that is just this really complex web of intersecting like relational challenges. You've got a bunch of people who just came off the Manhattan Project, physicists who are working there. You've got a bunch of Japanese physicists who've been recruited to come over because the universities in Japan have all been destroyed. And they're learning about semiconductors, and they're going to go back and they're going to form the semiconductor industry in Japan, but they're facing really intense racism. You have Russian spies running around trying to steal nuclear secrets. You have a lot of questions and controversy about the existence of nuclear weapons, and physicists who are involved in their creation are holding on to it. So there's a lot of kind of tension to navigate. And I remember when she passed away, we saw these plans of her dinner parties where she would sketch out a menu and then she would sketch out the table and she would put the names of each person at the table, and then next to them she would put the conversation that she wanted to seed with those people. And so she had this really beautiful way of thinking about how do you create exactly the right container to sort of ease through all of these tensions, to like find ways to help to navigate around this racism, to find ways to navigate around the real like grief and moral injury that folks were dealing with coming out of the Manhattan Project. And the many other things that were playing out in the department. And I remember looking at those and thinking about, I have a physics background in part because I'm inspired by my grandfather, comparing them to like a Feynman diagram, comparing them to the kind of really complex diagram a physicist might create, and thinking there's something about understanding how to create this really precise container for a relationship that's as sophisticated, as powerful as the physics that my grandfather was doing.
Yeah.
But we don't recognize in the same way. We don't sort of have a language for that brilliance of creating the conditions for a relationship, even though it's a thing that we all do all the time, even though it's a thing that's really, really needed in our world. And to your point, as a thinking about politics for parents, right? It's needed both because creating those sorts of spaces is how we create communities of care, and because those spaces, especially when they're places of mutual care, are where political power comes from.
Right. Exactly. And I guess, so we've talked a little bit about how you view relationships and the value of really like appreciating the importance of a relationship. And I think that the dynamic aspect to relationships. Um, your book also advocates for investing in relationships, investing in structures or these containers to allow relationships to grow. So I'd like to talk about like what does that look like for you? What institutions do we think may play a role in this
Mm.
investment? Like where can that occur? Not just as it pertains to parents, but just generally. What does that look like for you? What would like a successful outcome look like for you?
Building off the example of my grandmother,
Yeah.
I think about all of the people who are placemaking, all of the people who are creating the places where relationships happen,
Mhm.
where the ongoing maintenance work it takes to thrive, who are doing relationally intelligent, emotionally intelligent thinking in that really sophisticated way to bring those places together. And like it takes that sophistication. It also just takes a lot of work, right? You got to cook a lot of food, you got to clean, you've got to watch kids, you've got to set up chairs, right? Like there is economically meaningful labor that
Mhm.
goes into creating the conditions for a relationship.
Right.
And um, I think that um, there are some institutions I'm inspired by queer communities I've come from. I'm inspired by networks of mutual aid among disabled
Mhm.
folks. I'm inspired by many communities of faith where the
Right.
people who do that relational work get seen and
Yes.
other people know to show up and support them,
Yep.
right? Like there's a way for them to be recognized. Money flows to them when they need it. If
Mhm.
something happens to them, the community rallies to support them because the community knows how much they're needed.
Yeah.
Different kinds of skilled labor flow to them. People
Mhm.
are saying to their kids and grandkids, like, you need to go help this person figure out whatever with technology, right? That is I think there's some places where that really critical work gets supported, but I think we have become uniquely bad at supporting that work through some of our more kind of moneyed institutions. So in philanthropy, it's really, really hard to support organizations that do that kind of work. And part of
Mhm.
the reason is that um, there is a strong bias to, I believe, funding what is predictable. So when you create a relational container, when you do that really, really brilliant work, you can predict that it will lead to relationship, but you can't predict where those relationships will lead. The more successful you are, the more interesting and unpredictable the outcome is. So if you go to a foundation and you say, hey, I'm going to do some really powerful relational work. It's going to address the loneliness crisis. It's going to improve public health outcomes. It's going to build political power potentially around a cause that we care about. The foundation will say, great, what is the exact outcome that will happen? And how will you measure how much that exact outcome happens? And you have to say, I don't know. By definition, we can't know what the outcome is going to be. We can just know that it's going to be aligned with our values. And that is really, really hard for foundations to give money to, for social enterprises to give money to. There's a whole track in political organizing that I've seen where we've moved from funding a lot of that kind of organizing, funding places for people to come into relationship, to funding broadcast,
Mhm.
funding text messages, like
Yep.
first email, now text messages, um, email, other things that are like there's a predefined message. We're hitting people as many times as we can with that predefined message. Not because it's more effective than bringing people into relationship. Research around deep canvassing and other tactics has shown that bringing people into conversations where both of mutual change is vastly more effective than just hitting them with messages.
Yeah.
But hitting them with messages um, creates data about a conversion rate.
Yeah.
It lets you measure how many people have engaged with a message, how many people have said that they think the thing we want them to think because of the message. And so because broadcast is more predictable, it gets funded, even though a more relational and less uh, less controllable strategy would probably be a better way to build political power.
We could talk about that for hours because I've done my own time in measurement, especially in the philanthropy world. So I know what you're saying, but I guess to kind of pivot a little bit and bring this
Mhm.
back to why this is important, right? Why this is important, especially for parents. Another connection you make in the book is between loneliness and violent extremism,
Mm.
which I think is increasingly a concern in our country, globally. Um, and, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I mean, coming out of COVID, so many people, our mental health was damaged. The loneliness crisis just spiraled downward. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about, the investments your book is calling for, and kind of like underscore the importance of community, of relationships to kind of resolve some of these really, really toxic effects of loneliness, and kind of talk about, what it looks like when we can kind of try to combat these things with, meaningful relationships.
I can share a story,
Mm,
um, which is in the early days of the asexual community. We really focused on supporting people. We focused on bringing people in supportive relationship with one another, and as a result, we've become this kind of respected part of the queer world. And there are millions of people whose lives we've touched, and we've helped them accept themselves. We've helped them build intimacy on their own terms, and it's been really, really good.
mm,
When we were just starting as a community, we were kind of parallel to the incels. And in the early days, very early days, the incel community was like a supportive space for people who didn't have access to intimacy and wanted it. And the vision was they were going to create this place where people could learn to accept wherever they were on a journey and then support one another in forming healthy relationships.
mm.
And because
Real
the
quick there,
moderators,
for anyone that doesn't know about the term incel, because I think that's a term that's really it's used a lot in this discussion about extremism, but I don't,
hmm,
for the everyday person that maybe isn't in that dialogue, could you talk a little bit about, who this?
yeah. So I don't want to. Incel, which was originally short for involuntary celibate,
Mhm,
is a community that, after the thing I'm talking about, quickly became very, very toxic,
yeah,
extremely misogynist.
yeah,
And instead of being a place that supported people in forming intimacy on their own terms, it became a place where people sort of harbored and amplified a deeply toxic resentment
right,
that was targeted mostly at women,
mhm,
and then became targeted at a bunch of people.
yeah,
That community, members of that community began to engage in violent attacks and violent extremism, and it's now categorized as a terrorist organization. It's sort of the short version of what it is today.
yeah,
And I mentioned that not because I want to draw any more parallel between these two communities. They're very, very extremely different now, but because that, like, when people are lonely, there's kind of these different paths. They can be invited into connection, they can be supported in forming deep relationships with one another, or they can be invited into resentment,
right,
where they're told that, like, they're entitled to things that they're not getting, and they need to reject the people around them and sort of taking increasingly extreme actions to get the things that they're entitled to that they're not getting.
right,
um, and uh, Hannah Arendt, who was a famous sociologist who studied the Nuremberg trials, um, talked about how totalitarianism is institutionalized loneliness. It's what happens when many, many lonely people are sort of, their resentment is harnessed and then used to capture government power.
mhm,
And um, I thinking about the now pretty well documented rise of authoritarianism around the world. Different organizations which study democracy have come up with reports and are looking at the ways in which democracy is faltering around the world. I think there is a really deep link between that faltering and the um, also well documented increase in loneliness around the world.
All right. So that's pretty, I don't know. I mean, it's depressing, right?
Mhm.
But I mean, we're not doomed. There are so many great communities that have formed. There are so many great places, you highlight in the book where, relationships, meaningful relationships are being formed. There are containers, for those relationships. But it seems like we need more.
Yeah.
And we need to be intentional ourselves. And I think, your book demystifies it and gives everyone, I think, a framework to think about, okay, well, how can I create more meaningful relationships? And also, I think just being more inclusive. I think that comes hand in hand with community. And I think that also is incredibly important to our civic discourse in this country. Um, so I kind of like know what my takeaways are from the book, but I'd love to hear from you. I mean, for folks that are just sitting here thinking, wow, this is all really nice. Like, what can I do? How do I like, where do I even start?
So if I can try to weave together a few threads that we've had in this conversation, right?
Yeah.
There is a deep need for communities of care. We need them as parents. We
Mm.
need them around elders. We need them around folks in our community who are suffering for a wide range of reasons. And when we build those communities of care, I believe they always also become sites of power, sites of creative power, and potentially sites of political power, and sites of resistance to authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Um, and uh, the work, in order to create those communities of care, we need people at a local level who are bringing people together. So I think there's an extent to which we can become those people. There's also an extent which we can look, but not all of us are like extroverts, or I
Right.
don't think you need to be an extrovert, but like not all of us are in a position to be someone who's bringing people together. But I think we can look around and see who are those people around us who are bringing people together, and how do we resource them?
Okay.
How do we show up? How do we recognize what they're doing? How do we appreciate? How do we see if there's just little ways that we can support, and recognize how critical that work is? And one place where we could do that, and this is, I think, what I talk about a lot more in my book than we've talked about in this conversation, is how do we do that from within the institutions that we're part of?
Okay.
Because um, whether it's philanthropy, or you're in a corporate job, or you're in a political campaign, or you're in a school, chances are you're in an institution where that work of bringing people together is both really necessary and really invisible.
Right.
And chances are your institution has resources that are kind of structurally tied up, but that could be supporting that work of bringing people together, whether it's within your institution or outside of your institution, but align with your institution's core values. Like, there could be ways that your institution is showing up to support that work more than it is. And when I think about what I really want to see with when I think about the scale of this loneliness crisis, the scale of this crisis in democracy, I want to see our institutions relearn how to recognize and resource that work of building relationship. And I think a lot about how do we support people inside of those institutions who are going to advocate for that, who are going to practice them for themselves, that work of showing up,
Mm.
and then learn how to make the case that this is something their institution should be investing in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we've all worked in corporate settings, and especially now with the whole debate about, returning to the office, and collaboration days, et cetera. Um, you know, I always said, well, I'll go to the office if there's meaningful reasons to be there, right? If my team is there, if we're collaborating, fine. I'm not going to go sit in a cubicle, just for the sake of being in my seat when I spend most of the day like not talking to anybody, and just using Teams anyway, right? Um, so I think, I mean, on the one hand, it's great that you have the flexibility and the efficiency, but again, I think it goes back to the point of measurement, right? Like when you have, some type of, a lunch together or some type of an outing, um, it's hard for a corporation to really measure, well, was that successful? Was that worth everyone's time? And and in some cases, maybe it's not welcome to form, better relationships among the employees. Maybe there's a disincentive from, management for that to happen. So, it was really, kind of exciting for me to kind of read within your words, how to really think about that. Um, yeah. And I think since reading your book, every day I kind of think a little bit about intentionality in relationships and really, how impactful it would be not only in my own life and raising my children, but just generally in the country. I was listening to an analyst before the debate last night, and they were talking about how on either side of the aisle, um, each side is incredibly terrified of what the other one's going to do when they win. Um, and that's just such a sad place to be. We're so divided. People aren't really speaking to one another in these various communities in which we live. And there's not space to have like a rational discussion about where we're going and what we value as a country. So I think for so many reasons, it's a great time to have a book like this out. And I think, it's a really great time to just be thinking about this, and hopefully, people take the opportunity to kind of really give some thought to what you're talking about. And, we can kind of all form, stronger communities together and learn from one another.
Yeah, and just to reflect that back, my experience has been that if I started with learning to just intentionally create relationship in my own life, learning to see if there's relationships I want, how do I create the spaces for them to form? How do I find the spaces that other people are creating where they can form, and then show up to co-create and support those spaces? Like, just having that sense of relational agency in my own life where I'm like, oh, if they're relationships I want, I don't know exactly how they're going to happen, but I know how to find the places that make those relationships possible. Like, that was really personally transformative for me, has been. And I think many people have been on some version of that journey. And then once I'd learned that in my personal life, I could begin to exercise that skill in my political life and my institutional life. I could begin to say, in the political movements I'm part of, what relationships are missing and how could I show up to help create them? How could I support the underappreciated people who are showing up to create them? In my professional life, for my organization, what institutions move that work forward that I want to see happen? And how can I create the place for them? Or how can I recognize the underrecognized people who are creating the places for them? And that that ability to, I think, kind of like my grandmother, think relationally, see where relationships are possible, and see how we can show up to be a part of forming them, is a skill that's really, really needed in this world that's spiraling around loneliness and towards loneliness. And so that is a conversation that I'm hoping this book will help to create.
I think it will. So thank you so much for your time today. I know you're incredibly busy, and the book is coming out August 27th.
August 27th.
Okay. Where can people buy it?
So if you go to, if you just Google Relationality, David J., you'll be able to find a link. I can send a link to post in the show notes as well.
Perfect.
And it's available on, paperback, ebook, audiobook, however you want to consume your reading.
Awesome. Well, I really, really enjoyed it. I look forward to getting the paperback copy because I'm old school like that. And thank you again. And to anyone listening, I will definitely be, sending out a note once the book's available. You can follow the Politics for Parents Substack or go to amplifyinc.org/politics for parents for our website, and to get all the places where you can follow the podcast. So thank you so much, David. And thank you to everyone listening. And as always, I encourage everybody to kind of take a few moments to learn about David's work and to think about what you can do from here to really affect change in your own life and your own community. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm Dr. Stephanie Wilson. I'm a historian, an activist, and the host of the Freedom Over Fascism podcast, where we talk to people who give us insight into the current political moment, inspiration for state and local organizing, and connections with our co-conspirators all across the country. You'll meet rural organizers who focus on electing young and diverse candidates, independent journalists who prioritize democracy over disinformation, and candidates building change at the state and local level. I invite you to join the Freedom Over Fascism community and listen to Freedom Over Fascism wherever you get your podcasts.